Hi, I'm Jennifer Woosley Saylor. I'm a licensed professional clinical counselor and the kid of a cop. And this is the podcast When the Call Hits Home.
Hey everyone, it's Ashley Gethner. I'm a licensed clinical social worker and I'm also a child of a police officer.
Hi, and welcome back to the podcast. I'm Jennifer.
And I'm Ashley. And before we get started today, I have to call this out. I may sound a little different. I know I put it on our socials, but I did get Invisalign. So I'm working on these teeth and sometimes my speech is a little off, but we're gonna give it a go today. And hopefully it's not too bad because
I
can't
don't
take
think
it
it's
out.
bad at all, but she really wanted to get it out there that she thinks she sounds funny. I think she sounds wonderful as
Jennifer had a
always.
firefighter call me Daffy Duck. So, so I feel as though I have to call myself out before I
Right.
get like
Before they call you
comments.
out.
Yeah,
Mhm.
what is that with these firemen? They think they can
Uh,
just
oh, the first responders, they won't let you get by with anything, will they?
no, we're well, I just said this, dedicating our lives to this, and here we
Uh-huh.
are. No,
And
I'm
then
just
they're
kidding.
calling you Daffy Duck. Yeah.
Kind of
No.
love it because if they weren't picking on me, I
Yeah.
might be in a little bit more trouble. But
Exactly. It's
uh
definitely a sign of love in the first responder world if you're getting teased.
I was just this leads perfectly into what we wanted to discuss today because we were making some videos doing our little marketing stuff together, and we realized that while, yes, we are very heavy on what it's like to be a child of a first responder, and we don't want that to go anywhere. That's still our main
Never,
focus
ever.
here,
We'll be here forever with
right?
that. Yes.
Right. We also recognize that we haven't really tapped into much, I guess, on the clinical side. And I was venting, I'm going to put that out there,
Mhm.
venting respectfully about other kind of clinicians and how they've approached maybe this first responder world because there's not much of us. I don't
No,
know
there's
many.
not. Yeah. I mean, I think it's a very small group. I'm trying to think like back home and here. Yeah. I mean, it's just not a big, huge group.
I think that you and I are blessed because back where we work together, right? Like, of course, our group is specific for first responders.
Right.
So we're kind of lucky that we're surrounded by, but even then, what is that? Like 10 clinicians altogether? 10 to 12?
Yeah, I mean, it's not a big group, and that's pulling from an entire state. And, I'm out of state, and you're out of state with that too. So that's not even, I guess, in the state.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, that's a good point as well. And I just think it's important, in talking about this, it, there's just a lot that goes into having a therapist. I think I'll start with a little bit of it's like dating and who wants to do that. But, finding a good therapist, like it's not just the first therapist you walk in an office with. That may not be a fit. And then I guess talk a little bit about the qualification and competency of a first responder therapist. Like what's a little bit from the clinical side is important with that.
Yeah. Do you want me to answer that right now? Look at you throwing it. You're like, let's go.
You
Well,
said we're doing
I
questions.
know
I'm
we are.
sorry.
We are. Well, the first thing that I do kind of want to say, just because we have listeners on here, is that we can't, obviously, we're not your therapists. So, like, while we're giving you this education and we want you guys to take it, please don't come back to us in a little bit here. Like, we would love to take on everybody, though. That's for sure. I'm just saying, obviously, as a little caveat, we have to put that out there that in this role, we can't be everything for everybody. And so we just hope you take this as education. But I think that I think there's a lot of barriers. And I think there's a
Mm.
lot of things that, in order for a therapist to be competent, is that rude? Was that
No, I don't think that's rude.
in first responders, there are like vast differences. And I know in one of the little videos we just posted, we kind of gave a hint to what we are talking about today, right? Is that culturally aware of what it is like to be a first responder, I think is so important. So let's take what I just started with, right? It's such a little example, but the humor,
Hmm.
the dark humor, the pick on you behaviors that we get from our first responders is their is their love language almost, right?
Hmm.
And while you and I, like to me, that's second nature. Like
Right.
my dad
Right.
called, you know what I mean, makes fun of me all day, every day. So I definitely think that like it to me, I'm so used to it and I do love it. I love to also give it back to them. I think
Of
what's fair is
course.
fair. But I can
Yeah.
recognize how quickly like a different therapist may not understand that. And some
May
of the
not understand it at
things we're with
all.
are really bad, right? Like really dark stuff.
A gallows humor is what I've been told by first responders. And I think that it's interesting because, from my perspective, hearing that and how I feel with clients, it's like rapport building, right? Like it's, this putting people at ease. Like, I need to know that you're safe. So I got to make fun of you a little bit and see if I can rib you and if that's okay. And I think for some clinicians, they just don't have that ability to kind of be in a little bit of that gray spot. Yeah, and so I think that that's a good example of the difference of that for sure. I mean, I have some horror stories that I've heard of first responders going to therapist. One in particular I can think of is, a first responder going to a therapist, sharing their experience, and the therapist become physically, like, have an emotional response. And the first responder seeing that. And the session ended up with the first responder making the therapist feel at ease about
Mhm.
the situation. And that, sadly, I don't think that's just one of many of those kind of stories.
Yes, I have heard a lot of that before too. And I think what's important if you're a therapist wanting to work with first responders, right, is recognizing one, and we can kind of go back to this if you would like to, but like their trauma is vastly not that all trauma is very important, right? Like traumatic
Mhm.
situations and things like that. And it's bad per person. I'm not trying to say anything like that. But for some therapists, the amount of trauma and the type of trauma is
Mhm.
incredibly hard for them to digest,
Mhm.
right? And if you are not prepared to take on that, it really can leave a therapist probably, just like you're saying in that example,
Right.
overwhelmed, having an emotional response. I think we also tend to forget that our first responders, this is what they work for, is to protect us,
Exactly.
right?
Exactly.
And the minute as a therapist you show them like that you can't handle it, they do go into work mode. How do I
Mhm.
fix this? Ugh, ugh, ugh.
Mhm.
Sorry, I have to
Mhm.
stop there because I hear that from every first responder. How do I fix
Mm.
it? Sometimes you don't.
Right.
But how do I fix this? And I want to fix it with you. I don't want you to be exposed to the things that I'm exposed to. I've heard that a million times before too.
I have heard that as well. That's a good reminder. I haven't heard that one in a while, but I definitely have heard it. This idea of, why would I want to traumatize somebody else with the trauma, which is, what I love about our first responders. They want to protect people in so many ways. And even this act of, I would be a burden to kind of unload on a therapist, all that I've seen, and recognizing that there are competent therapists that have their skills and their ability to hear that and not take it on, which is, I think, what you're looking for in a therapist that can respond to first responders.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's one of those things too, right? Like, how do you, how do we get, actually, I'll throw this question to you if you don't mind,
Okay.
right? Because my brain's going with it. And while we were just talking there, I pulled up. So everybody knows that I try to take on the world. I don't hide that.
Hmm.
So I'll cue you in on this little course that I've been trying to create for therapists. So I pulled that up because I was like, let me make sure I'm hitting on some of these things that I have already put down onto paper and think are incredibly important. But like when you look at a first responder and we're talking about trauma, we're talking about all these different things, like how do you, as a therapist, Jennifer, make them feel comfortable in your office then?
That's a good question. I think what I start with is just being really open and honest. It's interesting with first responders, I think they need a lot of background about who I am, where I come from. I can't just be a complete stranger, though I am. So I think that that's a piece of letting them know a little bit about who I am, I think, is a start. But I also, go back to, it's such an exercise in trust.
Yep.
I give a background and things like that. I think that's a way in which I offer that I acknowledge, the first time I'm going to meet somebody, I'm going to ask you 1,000 questions. And that's just, just trying to see how I can best serve you. And, also give the option of like, if there's a question you don't want to answer. I think sometimes it's nice to create a space of like, you get to drive the ship a little bit here. And I think for first responders, especially with maybe having a little bit of control, this is something outside of our comfort zone so much, just giving them a little piece of that. Nowadays I get to say that I've worked with first responders for a long time. And so that I think buys me a little bit of credit. But previously to that, I didn't have that initially. And so it is something that you're just trying to offer control. And I also think I've been doing it long enough and I've been interrogated by
I
enough.
was just about to say, yeah.
I have been interrogated by enough first responders. And I think that they can say that like that doesn't scare me or bother me. Like I recognize like they need that and I respect that. And whatever questions you have, and if you want to see every single note I write, whatever that is to make you feel safe and comfortable, I'm willing to accommodate that. Because this is, again, like I said in our little video, like therapy is a hard thing. It's not an easy thing. And so whatever I can do to offer some levels of comfort with that, I would.
Yeah, no, I love that so much. And it is true. I've had that happen to me too. I do think there's some testing that some of our
Hmm.
first responders will do, which I think is fair, right? Like I
Hmm.
recognize when it's happening. But if you're a therapist who doesn't work with first responders, right, that can be kind of intimidating. And it's important for people to recognize that. But it's also important, I think, for our listeners who may be clinicians, who may be first responders, children, what have you, right, to know that it is your right to do that though, too.
Exactly. And I think that's why I go back. It's, such a silly analogy about, finding a therapist. It's kind of like dating. But I say this to all my clients as well. Like, I hope, it works out and that I'm a good fit for you. But, therapists are kind of like shoes, and sometimes you have to try on a couple pairs. There's that pair that, oh my gosh, they look great. They're so awesome, but they rub blisters. And then there's that pair that is way too loose and it's just, doesn't fit. And, there can be that funky pair, but it fits just perfect. You kind of have to see if that fit. And listen, trust your gut. If it doesn't feel like a good fit, that's okay. It's not about the therapist feelings, it's about you because this space is about you.
Yeah. Absolutely. I think that's so fair too. I think that's something that I've always stressed, and this may be a little thing, but to some people it's a pretty big one too, right? Working with first responders is like I do have some first responders that come right when they get off shift or what have you. And so weapons are a
Hmm.
thing, right?
Yep. Yep.
And I don't care. But again, is that because I grew up with that? So like to
Hmm.
me, I don't stop to even think about it. I have been kind of I don't know what the right word would be, but like if someone sees it or recognizes it, like kind of been like other clinicians that I work with are close to being like, oh, you don't mind that? I mean, again, I don't. I don't know if that's because I am a child of a first responder. And so to me, like I said, guns are just what they are. But I also know that speaking from my clinician brain, that is something that if they're finally coming to talk to me, right? Like in opening up and feeling safe and secure, like you can't, I don't know. I want your feedback on this. I'm not saying I'm right or
Yeah.
wrong here, but like that, their service weapons are huge comfort and safety to them in a lot of different ways. I don't know, like as a clinician, I would never even think to ask them to not have that here. Now, most of the time when they're off duty, they don't, right? Like they
Hmm.
just don't. But like, wouldn't be the first one to tell a first responder or a police officer more specifically, right? Like you can't have that. And I think that's vastly obviously different than doing therapy with civilians most of the time.
No, I definitely agree with that. It's interesting. I'm like, yeah, I am more concerned about you having your radio off and your
Yeah.
phone on silent and your smartwatch off. Like, I'm more interested in you getting to be completely focused in our session, whether you have your weapon on or not. No, I do think we get in a different conversation when there are thoughts of suicide, when there
Right.
are things like that. And that is, I just want to point that out there. I know you know that difference, Ashley. I just want to say that for the listeners that,
100%.
that would be a different conversation that a therapist might have with the first responders if they have a concern, that somebody might use their weapon to harm themselves.
Yeah.
Yeah, like again, that's, not unusual, but I think it's a good point. And this is the other thing I wanted to say to that. I hear if a clinician has an issue, which a clinician has a right to have an issue. I'm not saying
Right.
anything about that, but I think you're putting another hurdle between a first responder and getting services. And again, I think how you show up saying like, hey, it doesn't bother me. Why would I create any other, boundary or any other thing that makes it harder for you to come in and sit in my office and us talk?
Well, and I just think grand scheme when I'm talking about this too, like, isn't this why police officers don't want to come?
Mhm.
Because of that. And let's take it there, right? Like that stigma, that notion of like, if I finally go to therapy, I'm nervous that it's going to get back to my job. I'm nervous that I'm
Mhm.
going to lose my job. I mean, these are just things that I've heard from, law enforcement, even fire, any, coming in.
Right.
I'm fearful that they're going to take away my weapons because I'm getting mental health help. Like all these things that create, I think, barriers in their own mind. I
Right.
mean, some of it may be true. I'm not here to
Of
say that.
course.
We know that
Yeah.
there's dysfunction within organizations. I haven't been quiet about that. So some of this may be true, but I think that like, right, like I guess that's where my brain goes is so big scheme here is I think that's a huge barrier. Is
Yeah.
the stigma and the notion of like all these things can be taken away from me. And these are all things that I love and I do, and they're my protective factors.
I think it's good that you bring that up as well, because that's not one thing that I was on my list when we were kind of talking about cultural competence and hurdles and stuff. That wasn't on my list. So I'm glad that that is something that you bring up because I think that's true for our first responders. Yeah. The other thing is, I think you're bringing up the confidentiality piece. Like, would this make me lose my job or could people find out and things like that? I have some really strong feelings about that. Number one, Ashley, I mean, the one thing we get to offer our clients is confidentiality. Like
Yeah.
that is the cornerstone of what I do. It's why it is different than just talking to a friend. It's why it is different than just going and blowing steam with your buddies, drinking some beers. Like there's this beautiful thing about confidentiality that whatever is said, minus three things, you're right? That's if you're going to harm yourself, someone else, or any kids. But that's something we'll always have a conversation up front, but we can talk about anything and it's completely confidential. And I've had people that are so concerned about that we don't use their insurance. And I couldn't even tell you their name if you asked me because, making it so hard to not have any records of that. But I think that that is something that's really important, that you should be able to talk to your therapist and know that none of that information is ever going to go anywhere. That has to be something. And I have some concerns with colleagues at times. Actually, I've probably told you this story before. I got a letter from attorney's office about something, and I had a colleague I was working with was like, "Well, you just need to send them the records." And I said, "This is a letter from an attorney. Like, I don't have to send anything." And it just made me sad. Like, they did not have the awareness to know, like, the difference between a subpoena and even if you are subpoenaed, you can talk to a judge. Like I've done that before. Y'all, I will fight tooth and nail. People are not getting my information. Like you have to give me that permission for me to even acknowledge that. And even then, I would fight to share that. So I don't know. I think that's an important thing to recognize in our field. And I think first responders really need to know that. Obviously you work within organizations. I don't know if you have different feedback with that as well.
In terms of like confidentiality. So
Yeah.
I think that something that I have learned where I'm at now is really beautiful because they take that to a very high degree. Like, I
Hmm.
don't get pressured. I've never been pressured from anybody higher up or anything like that. ever asking who's coming to see me. They literally, they're like, I don't even want to know. Like, they don't ask, they don't push, they don't,
It's
nothing like
beautiful.
that, which
Yeah.
is beautiful because, and this isn't to scare people, this is just the realities and the truth is that's not how it is at some places, right?
No, it's not, sadly.
But
Yeah.
I think so. I don't know, and I don't want to be too boring. I don't want to bore people, but there is like confidentiality and then there's privilege.
Mm-hmm.
Privilege takes it kind of a step even further than confidentiality. As a therapist, we have privilege, which
Mm-hmm.
is a really good thing that's on our side. Helps us in these events, such as being subpoenaed and things like that, right? And
Right.
I don't want to go into all of that. People could also look it up. But like here in the state of Wisconsin, I spoke to pass a bill, to help pass a bill. And what they're trying to do is, and it got passed, which is pretty cool, but
That's awesome.
I know I was so nervous. But what they're trying to do is, and again, we don't have all day here. Maybe people feel opposite or what have you, but what we're trying to do here is get it so peer support members also have privilege.
Mm-hmm.
We're trying to really bolster this peer support in Wisconsin. Now, obviously, there's a lot of caveats to that, the way it's
Of
written, a
course.
lot to it. So that's why it's like hesitant of me to even bring this up. But I say that because that's how far, at least with the departments that I'm working with here, they are going to try to show their members that, hey, we're in this to protect you at every angle we can.
Right.
Because at the end of the day, I think we're all so tired of seeing those numbers of suicides higher than anything else,
Right.
right? And so
Yeah.
we have to put things into place, and this is a way to do it. And so
I
I'm
think
very
that's
blessed on that
beautiful.
end. But I will say that of course, I know when we bring organizational dysfunction and unhealthy people, just like there is in every
Of
career,
course. Of course.
to the table, that people want to push that button and want to give it, like want you to give it up, want you to share
Mm-hmm.
and things like that, and you can't,
Oh,
right?
yeah.
Like
Absolutely.
you just can't.
Yeah, and it's hard, but I think that that's something that you should always feel with your therapist, that they're out to protect your information and what you've shared.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I do think that is beautiful that you guys are really making some legislations and protecting that and honoring that. Unfortunately, I hear kind of the opposite. If anybody even says, at one time I was thinking about harming myself, they want to like lock it down. They're just so scared about, some liability piece instead of just really honoring, like, no, if somebody's being honest about that, we can help them. It's just
Yeah.
when people aren't talking about it, it's when people don't have anybody to share with and speak, that's when the real dangers happen. And so I think it's great that that's moving in that direction.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. I think that actually this whole topic is what motivates me more so than anything, is because I have like a little bit of a front row seat to a department literally going great lengths as to calling centers to try to ask about their people and stuff, and like what why are we doing that? Like what
Right.
good could possibly come from that? Like if we are getting the help we need and everything, you know what I mean? Like
Mhm.
I'm just very passionate about this because in my eyes, and I've said this before and I'll say it till the day I hopefully retire. You never know. But like if our officers or firefighters, whoever, are better mentally, they're going to be better on the job. They're going to be better for their communities.
Mhm.
If it's a systems theory, we have to start somewhere. So whether that be with an individual person, which obviously you and I both work very heavily at that, then let it be. So be it. Why do we have, and I think this goes right into our discussion that we're having right now, right? This all other part of being culturally aware. Because I'll be honest, a lot of these departments are a little bit better than like Bravo TV reality. I'm like, first off, if this was a
Uh,
show, I would be watching it. Um,
as the firehouse turns, yeah.
yeah,
Mhm.
right? And like,
Soap
ooh, let me get
opera.
my popcorn and yeah, exactly. Like, because the real housewives ain't got nothing on department.
And I will say some of these first responders, these big burly dudes, they got all the tea. They're willing to gossip, and it's like, come
It's
on
true too,
now.
you guys, but all of it, right? And then guess
Mhm.
what? It almost feels like, and this is with every department that I've worked with, right? It almost feels like it's somebody's turn every day of the week, right? Like
Mhm.
it's and that organizational piece, this is where it all comes in. But it's super important. I don't want to go down that rabbit hole to be aware of that as a therapist because there's so many times when I sit in my office that I have no control
Mhm.
over what is going on because the department is coming after somebody and they feel like their back's up against the wall, right? And that's hard as a therapist, but you have to learn how to work with all of that.
Absolutely. And then, we have small communities at times. You could have three people from the same place coming in with three different sides of the same story too, and I think as a therapist, you have to be able to compartmentalize that and be present for each one of those in a different way.
So I'm gonna take this here really fast. So look at I'm waiting for your eyes to be like, Ashlee, do not do it. But
Here we
you
go.
know me, I'm a little bit of the if people haven't realized this, I'm a little bit of the wild child.
Yes, I'm the
Definitely.
oldest, responsible, and you're the
Yeah,
baby.
you
It's our
exactly. You
dynamic.
like
It's our
slurp me
dynamic.
back in. You're like, Jesus Lord
Mhm.
Ash. This is like when we're talking about drama, one thing that I feel like as a clinician, you have to be prepared for because I'm throwing myself under the bus. Infidelity is huge within these
Mhm.
departments.
Mhm.
It is a thing, right? I mean that with all my respect and love, but it's real and I'm not going to hide it. It is so hard as a clinician sometimes to work with that when like your own thought is like, oof, right? You're a human before you're a clinician and you have to really check those biased thoughts and everything, but
Right.
it is hard to work with stuff like that. But it's also important to recognize that those things happen when you're working with first responders and I use the biology of the brain to back some of that stuff up,
Right.
and to completely understand it.
I'm
But
an attachments kind of gal when it comes to those things, but yes.
100%, right? Like
Mhm.
100%, you have to take into account all those things instead of just hearing at face value. I think it would be really easy for a therapist who isn't in this field to recognize that there's a lot more to that than just hearing the infidelity
Right.
part.
Right. That you're a dirty dog and yeah,
Yeah.
all those kind of things for sure.
Yeah, 100%. And I just think that's important to tap into, right?
Yeah,
Like,
I mean, I think that you act like you're going to blow something up here. I think you're just a truth teller, Ashley, which is, I think, why it's so great that we're having these conversations to say, hey, this does happen. There are these dynamics that are showing up, and that's impactful to a family, right? That's impactful
100%.
to kids of first responders. And so if we're going to pretend that that's not happening, then that's not us really showing up completely to this community. So I think it's good that you're saying that.
Yeah, I do think that there is so much truth to that. Everything, right? And we talk about this, but it's beyond that. Like everything that happens to our first responder, it does impact the family. Which is
Mhm.
why I even have it down here that I hope one day to make to fruition this course for therapists to take to work with first responders is a whole section on families,
Mm.
right?
I think that's a powerful thing because I mean, I've been to good and bad presentations in this field for a long time now. You go to the ones that are just kind of glossing over, just trying to put first responders in boxes, really,
Yeah.
and so the depth of that, right? What's a value system? Where's integrity? Where, are these deeper things when you are meeting with somebody who happens to have the profession of first responding. And so I think it's really powerful to know when that class and course is available that will offer kind of all those layers.
You coming in on it with me, right?
Yes, yes, of
Guys, look at
course.
everybody. Let me put her on the spot right now. She can't say no because we're hearing this. I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. But right, because we run into this way too much of we don't have enough therapists to help our first responders. We have all these therapists in the world that maybe they don't want to. Hey, I respect that. I'm not saying you have to.
No,
Um,
that's a good therapist that says this isn't for me. Like,
and it's
yeah.
definitely not for everybody. But
Mhm.
I feel like as a therapist, what can I do to make this better, to make this community bigger, and that's the only way I can think is to educate, right?
Hmm.
But I also want to turn this question to you as we try to kind of, I know we're rogue a little bit again this episode, but I love it. If we have first responders listening, which I hope we do at this point.
Yeah, me too.
Thanks, Dad. No, like our dads.
Uh-huh.
So if there is a first responder listening, one, include your families in therapy. I think that's beautiful as well. But what would you say to them in terms of like just kind of bringing it back in? What would be important? How to, what should they look for in a therapist? Like you said, I guess just creating this safe space, interrogating them. Is there anything else that you could think of to be like, hey, this might be helpful?
For first responders that are going to therapy, like what would
Yeah,
be important?
or they want to.
Yeah, I think a seasoned therapist is good, especially if this is your first time into therapy. There's a lot of opportunities sometimes who people are fresh out of school and thank goodness, because I was one of those people at one time. But I think sometimes when you're dealing with, what we're talking about here, Ashley, when you're having to see some really gruesome stuff that mainstream, people aren't having to deal with, you do need somebody that's seasoned. So I would recommend that. The other thing, I think this is silly, but it's so true. You got to have somebody that's willing to work with your schedule. I cannot
Oh,
with these
what a good point.
therapists that have banking hours. I mean, what I would give to work, 10 to 2, Monday through Thursday. I know that's kind of a silly one, but I think it's true. I mean, it's amazing to me how hard sometimes it is just scheduling. And sometimes, I mean, Ashley, you know this, like you're full. Like, I just don't, there's not another day of the week that I could schedule people. I mean, there's those things that you come up against. But you guys have crazy enough schedules as it is. Like, try to find somebody that's willing to work with your schedule. So again, seasoned, somebody that's flexible with your schedule. And also, again, like, what are you looking for? Are you needing somebody that's just really validating you and supporting you and just being a place to like unload? Are you needing somebody that, is going to call you on stuff? Like, I mean, there's those kind of therapists. Like, it's kind of a mix of what that could look like. I think a good therapist is somebody that can balance both of those, that can hold you accountable at times, but also just offer validation and no judgment. Like we're not doing rocket science here. Like
Right.
there's some things in that are just simple. And again, trust your gut. If it feels like a good fit, it is. If it doesn't feel like a good fit, that's okay. And you can ask your therapist for another therapist. Like
True.
you
Yeah.
totally can. It might be a little awkward, but that's a good tell if it's a good therapist or not. Because trust
Correct.
me, I have sent many a client to somebody that was a better fit for them, because it's not about me. It's not about me at all. It's about what's best for that
It's
client.
funny you say that because just recently too, like me and another clinician she's one of my only other clinicians up here. It's like me
Hmm.
and her that go back and forth with first responders, with clients and stuff. But we were giggling the other day to each other because I referred a first responder back to her because I'm too young. He doesn't
Hmm.
like the fact that I'm as old as his kid,
Yeah.
right? Like it can be as simple as that. I
Yeah.
can't control my age. Well, like I cannot, and I understand that. But he was just like, it's hard for me. And I think I only saw him once because that
Hmm.
blocked him. Like he was just
Right.
you're just really young. Like that is fine. But it could be as simple as like, I didn't take that personal. I get that. It's not always
Hmm.
easy, probably taking advice from someone who is younger than you, right? Like, so it's just like can be those little things, but you're right. Like I made sure he got to the right therapist.
Yeah, and you can just honor that. Like again, a good
Yeah.
therapist can just honor that and say, like, it's not about me. What is the other? Oh, if you've seen a therapist, you can always go back and see that therapist again.
Yeah.
Like I have that happen all the time where I'm working with somebody, they get so much better. Things are great. I don't hear from them. And, sometimes 2, 3, 5, I haven't had 10 years yet, but a long time can go by and they'll reach back up and we just pick back up. Like it's not, that's a good fit. That's a good fit. So yeah, those are all. And then, obviously insurance, use your insurance, but also sometimes there's therapists and they can give first responder discounts. I know that's a thing out there too. So
Yeah, that can get figured out. I always say never let that stop you, really, right? Like I understand why it does,
exactly.
but
Yeah.
it shouldn't be a factor if we're talking about someone's life, right? Like
Mhm.
we won't be able to cover it in this episode, but I do want to get into like one of these times interventions a little bit more too, right? Because I think the stigma of going to therapy is that these first responders come in and lay on my couch and I ask them how they feel every 5 minutes about
Oh
something.
yeah.
And
Yeah.
like, whoa, we are way past that, my friends. So we'll have to spend some time on that in another episode as well, because we can break that stigma pretty quickly on here.
That's a good point. Yeah. That it's not just talk about your feelings. That's not just what we're here for. So, yeah, that's good. Oh, and let me tell you, you'll get to a place where I remember being the young therapist and people being like, I don't know, she's so young. And then the day I realized, like, oh, I'm not young anymore. That's not an issue for my clients. You'll get there one day,
I'm
Ashley.
creeping up on it. Trust me. Trust. I had a
Oh, but
client
you're
tell
not.
me, I had a client tell me, not that I need to throw around age in here, but I did have a client tell me the other day, he was like, oh, I thought you were 38. And I was like, oof, all right. Like,
How dare you?
thanks,
How dare you?
thanks. Like in my head, I'm like, ouch. Okay. Like, not that 38 is old, but like, okay, I'm not quite, but
Yeah, yeah,
I gotta start working.
yeah. You know how they say kids say the darndest things,
No, it's
clients say the
a
darndest
hundred
things.
percent, and it's definitely always my first responders. And I'm like, oh, this is why I love you guys so much.
Well,
Like,
the only reason that would ever be said is not by anything about you, how you look. You look like so young, but it is your wisdom, Ashley. You have a lot of wisdom past your years in a lot of ways. So,
I
so yeah,
appreciate that. That was so kind.
of
Well, I learned
course.
from the best, such as yourself and those around me. So that's all I can keep doing is learning from you guys. But I mean, we've covered a lot of ground today.
We have. I'm like, oh gosh, I just looked at the clock, so I guess we should give these people a break.
I know. That's why I was like, oh boy, I should not bring up interventions, but we are going to talk about that. We do bring back, I don't know, sometimes it's just so nice for Jennifer and I to keep going with our thoughts, but we do bring back some guests coming up, some really, really cool ones. So keep looking out, right?
Yeah, we'll have some fun guests showing up, and we appreciate your time today.
Absolutely. Don't forget, guys, that when the call hits home, Jennifer and I are always here for you, and we look forward to our next episode.
Have a good one.